Joe sat back in his chair, arms folded, eyes squinting slightly as if he were trying to see something beneath the surface of the words that hadn't been spoken yet. "Beyoncé," he said, not flippantly but slowly, almost like a prayer. "When did you feel closest to God?" There was a silence, not the kind that's empty, but the kind that waits for something sacred. She blinked once, then looked down. "It wasn't on stage," she said, voice hushed, like she didn't want to scare the memory away. "It wasn't during a concert or after a Grammy. It was in a bathroom, on the floor, at 2 a.m. Joe didn't interrupt. "I was crying," she continued. "I don't even remember what broke me that night. It wasn't one thing. Just life had stacked up so high I couldn't breathe underneath it." She swallowed. Her hand grazed the table. "I whispered, 'God, if you're real, I don't need lights. I just need you.'" Her voice cracked, just slightly. And for the first time in my life, the silence felt holy. Joe's brow furrowed. "Holy?" "Yeah," she nodded. "Not comforting, not warm, but heavy, like someone was listening, not answering, not explaining, just there." She glanced up at him. "I think I met God there, not as a man in the sky, not as a judge, but as presence, a stillness that didn't try to fix me." Joe leaned in. "So, was that the moment you started believing?" Beyoncé gave a half smile. "That's the thing. I don't know. I didn't leave that bathroom with answers. I left with questions that didn't scare me anymore." Silence again. Joe looked like he was about to say something, but then didn't. Instead, he just breathed out, slow. "I think we've confused God with performance," Beyoncé whispered. "Like he only shows up when we're perfect. But I was the furthest thing from perfect that night." The room felt heavier, like her words had soaked into the walls. Then, almost like a shift in wind, she added, "You know what's strange? I've sung in front of millions. But that night, whispering into the silence, I felt more heard than I ever have in my whole life." Joe's eyes glistened for a moment. Not tears, but something softer, slower. "Do you think," he said carefully, "that we only find God when we finally stop trying to impress him?" She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she looked down again. Her fingers touched the edge of her water glass. "When a child cries," she said, "the mother doesn't wait for the right words. She just comes." Joe sat back, like the sentence hit something he didn't know needed hitting. But before he could respond, she asked quietly, almost to herself, "What if God never left? What if we just stopped listening?" And with that, the silence returned. Not empty, just waiting. Joe didn't speak for a while. He just looked at her, not like a host, not like a skeptic, like a man who was remembering something he'd tried hard to forget. The weight of what Beyoncé had said didn't drift away. It stayed, settling in the room like dust in light. "You ever wonder," Joe finally said, his voice lower now, "if maybe we've been listening for the wrong kind of voice?" She raised an eyebrow gently. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he shrugged. "I always expected that if God was real, he'd sound like thunder. Big, loud, obvious." He paused, thinking, "But maybe the loudest things in life are the things that never needed to shout." Beyoncé smiled, but it wasn't a performance smile. It was tired. True. "I used to think God was waiting for me to succeed," she said. "Like I'd earn his love once I did enough, became enough. But it turns out, God met me when I was empty." She rubbed her wrist absent-mindedly. "There was this moment. I was staring at the tile floor. You know how cold tile feels against your skin when you're crying? It's grounding, almost merciful." Joe nodded slowly, like he'd been there too. "I didn't feel fixed," she said. "That's the strange part. I didn't stand up with my problems solved, but I stood up, unalone. A beat. Joe leaned forward, elbows on the table. That sounds like love. Maybe it was, she replied, but not the love I sang about on records. This wasn't flowers or fireworks. It was stillness that didn't run. She looked up and caught his eyes. Love that sits with you in the mess, doesn't clean it up, just stays. Joe blinked slowly. Do you think that's what Jesus was trying to show us? That kind of love? Beyoncé hesitated. The question hung in the air like a lantern. Then she said quietly, maybe Jesus wasn't trying to be worshipped. Maybe he was trying to be followed. That made Joe sit back. He knelt with the broken, touched people nobody would touch. He didn't hand out formulas. He cried. He got tired. He bled. If that's not love that understands pain, I don't know what is. Joe's voice was almost a whisper now. So, not a God of answers, but a God of presence? She nodded. But here's the thing, she continued, her voice tightening just a little. Once you feel that presence, you can't go back to noise. You can't unfeel it. Silence becomes holy, and everything loud starts to feel fake. Joe exhaled sharply. So where do you go from there? She looked at him, long, almost sadly. I've been asking that for years. Another silence stretched between them, different this time. Not awkward, just real. And then she said it, almost to herself. Is it possible to follow love, even when it doesn't lead where you thought it would? Joe didn't answer, maybe because the question wasn't really for him. It was for the listener. Joe shifted in his seat, like the question had cracked something open. Not broken, just exposed. You know, he said, most people wouldn't expect you to be the one asking that. Beyoncé, the icon, the powerhouse. What does someone like you still need? She let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in her chest for years. Permission, she said simply. Joe tilted his head. Permission to not always be strong, to not always know, to need. People don't like it when their heroes are fragile. He nodded slowly. And yet, the strongest people I know, they're the ones who've let themselves fall apart. Beyoncé looked down, fingers tracing the condensation on her glass. I remember this one night, she said, a few months after that bathroom floor moment. I was in a hotel, alone. I had everything, the view, the room service, the awards. And I sat on the edge of the bed and thought, why do I still feel like something's missing? Joe didn't interrupt. I used to think success would silence the ache, she continued. But success just makes the room quieter. And in that quiet, the ache echoes louder. Her voice cracked slightly. I thought faith would make it go away. That if I just believed hard enough, I'd finally be whole. But that's not what faith did. Joe leaned in, eyes searching hers. Then what did it do? It made me stop pretending I wasn't aching, she said. Joe sat back. The truth of it landed hard. Faith didn't fix me, she whispered. It made me honest. There was a pause. Then he asked, almost cautiously, so, what do you do with the ache? She looked up. Her eyes were watery but calm. I sit with it. I don't try to numb it anymore. I ask it what it wants to teach me. I let it lead me to places I used to avoid, old wounds, fears, even beauty I overlooked because I was too busy performing. Joe was still. Beyoncé continued. I think love, real love, doesn't remove the ache. It shares it. That's what makes it holy. Jesus didn't take away pain. He stepped into it. She looked at Joe, really looked at him. And that's when I started wondering, what if the ache isn't a problem? What if it's an invitation? Joe blinked. To what? To deeper love. To stop fixing and start listening. To stop performing and start being. He stared at her, like something in his soul had just shifted. And then she asked, so quietly it almost didn't register, what if the ache isn't something to escape, but the place where God is waiting? The words landed like a feather and a brick. Joe didn't speak. Couldn't, maybe. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was holy again. Joe's voice came low and gravelly after a long pause. I've talked to monks, scientists, war veterans, ayahuasca shamans, but I've never heard someone say that before, that the ache is where God is. Beyoncé nodded slowly. It's where I found him. Or where he found me. Joe rubbed his hands together like he was trying to ground himself. You think that's what we've missed? In the noise, in the chasing? I think, she said gently, we've confused healing with hiding. We hide behind goals, spirituality, even religion, trying to look okay instead of asking what the wound is trying to reveal. She looked down, thoughtful. I used to pray for answers, she said. Now I pray for honesty, not because it feels good, but because it's the only way I still feel real. Joe was silent. Then, almost hesitantly, he asked, was there ever a moment you wanted to give it all up? Beyoncé chuckled, but it wasn't light. It was the kind that carries a history. More than once. You know what's funny? The higher you climb, the more invisible your pain becomes. People assume that if you're shining on the outside, you must be safe on the inside. She paused, eyes locked on his. But that's not how it works. Sometimes the brightest lights cast the longest shadows. Joe blinked. That one hit. There was a night after a huge tour, she went on. The kind of night most people dream about. Fireworks, encore, screaming fans. And then I was alone in a hotel room. Took off my lashes, washed the makeup off, sat in silence, and I thought, if I disappear tomorrow, who really knows me? She smiled faintly. That's when I realized I was starving for something no spotlight could give me. Joe leaned in. So what did you do? I started talking to God again. Not like I used to. Not like a genie or a checklist. I talked to him like a father, a friend, like someone who didn't need me to impress him. Just someone who wanted me honest. She looked at him, vulnerable. I told him I was tired of the show. Not the music, not the art. I love those. But the mask, the pretending. I wanted to be seen, and still loved. Joe was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, barely above a whisper, did you feel seen? She nodded. More than ever. Not by the world, by something deeper, something eternal. Joe breathed slowly, like the air itself had thickened. And then Beyoncé said, that's why I stopped chasing perfect. Perfect doesn't need love. Only the broken do. The words hung in the air like a confession. And then she asked him, gently but directly, when the applause fades, who still knows your name? Joe swallowed. Hard. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. The silence between them now wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Like church, but without the pews or robes. Just two people sitting in the honesty of what they couldn't fix. Joe finally spoke, barely above a whisper. You know, I think that's what scares people the most. Not being forgotten, being unseen. Like their soul never fully made it to the surface. Beyoncé nodded, her voice soft. That's why I stopped praying for answers. I started praying to be known, even when I didn't know myself. Joe looked up. You think God hears us, even when we don't know what to say? I think God especially hears us then, she said. You know what I realized? Some of my most honest prayers were the ones I never finished. She smiled faintly, like the ones that start with, God, I don't even know what I'm feeling right now, and just end in tears or silence. Joe leaned back, breathing deeply. Maybe God's not a sentence we get right, he murmured. Maybe he's a presence that sits with us in the ones we never finish. There was a long pause. Then Beyoncé said, I used to think vulnerability was weakness, but now I think it's worship. Joe raised his eyebrows. Worship? She nodded, not in the Sunday morning way, but in the here I am, messy and still breathing way. The kind of worship that doesn't need music, just truth. She looked away, eyes glistening. You ever look at yourself in the mirror, she asked, and wonder if the world fell in love with the mask you made and not the soul underneath it? Joe didn't answer. His silence was the answer. That's why I needed that bathroom floor, she said quietly. It wasn't glamorous. It was real. And sometimes I think the most faithful thing you can do is fall apart in front of God and not apologize for it. She glanced back at Joe. We apologize too much for being human. Joe's throat moved as he swallowed. Beyoncé continued more gently now. Jesus never asked perfect people to follow him, just honest ones. And I think the world's starving for something real, something that won't ghost you when your strength runs out. She leaned forward. I don't think God is looking for perfect faith. I think he's just asking, will you still come to me when all you have is a whisper left? Joe sat back in his chair. His eyes were misted, but he didn't wipe them. You know what's wild? He said finally. This conversation feels more like church than most churches I've ever been in. Beyoncé smiled, a bit broken, a bit free. That's because truth is sacred, she said. And sacred things don't need stained glass. They just need honesty. And then she whispered it like a secret. What if the most powerful prayer isn't, God fix me, but God stay with me, even if I never get fixed? Joe closed his eyes. The ache had a voice now. Joe opened his eyes slowly, like waking up from a dream that had been more real than anything he'd lived through wide awake. He looked at Beyoncé, not the icon, not the voice, but the woman. And somehow the silence between them still hadn't left. It had just deepened, softened, settled. He exhaled. You know, I always thought if I had enough answers, enough evidence, enough books, I'd find peace. She nodded gently. And did you? He shook his head. I found arguments, theories, but not peace. She leaned forward, elbows on the table. I used to think peace was the absence of chaos. Now I know it's the presence of God in it. Joe looked down at the table. There's a question I've never been able to answer, he said quietly. If God is real and good, why does he let us feel so alone? Beyoncé didn't flinch. Because, she said, if we never felt alone, we'd never know the miracle of being met in our aloneness. Joe blinked. Presence doesn't always come before pain. Sometimes it comes through it. He sat in that thought like someone sitting beside a grave, both mourning and somehow, inexplicably, thankful. Beyoncé's voice was almost a whisper now. There's something sacred about the moments no one claps for, no one posts about, the ones where it's just you and breath and God. She smiled faintly. Faith, to me, isn't knowing God exists. It's choosing to believe he's still good when everything in me feels broken. Joe tilted his head, studying her. So what do you believe now? She looked away, then back. I believe God is love, not the soft kind, not the polite kind, the staying kind. The kind that shows up in the mess and doesn't walk out when you cry too long. I believe Jesus didn't come to make us religious. He came to show us how to love like that. She looked up at him, eyes wet. I believe God doesn't need perfect prayers, just honest hearts. And I believe that sometimes the closest we ever get to heaven is when we let ourselves be fully seen and still fully loved. Joe swallowed hard. And the ache? He asked. Does it ever go away? She took a long breath. No, she said, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. A pause. I used to ask God to remove the ache. Now I ask him to stay in it with me. She smiled, not as a performance, but like someone who had found something no one could steal. Joe leaned back, let the silence have the last word for a moment, and then, quietly, he said, maybe that's all we really want, in the end. Not escape, not answers, just someone who doesn't leave when the lights go out. Beyoncé nodded. That's what God is to me. Not the one who fixes everything, but the one who stays. even if nothing gets fixed. The camera stayed on them for just a moment longer. Two people, no music, no miracles, just honesty. And maybe that was holy enough.